Hi, welcome everyone. Let's get started. My name is Jed Greenberg. I'm the president of the student chapter of the Rice University Federalist Society, and I'd like to introduce our speakers to you. First off, our moderator, courtesy of Rice University. Dr. Paul Brace is the Clarence L. Carter Professor of Political Science at Rice. He is the co-author of Follow the Leader, Opinion Polls and the Modern Presidents, author of State Government and Economic Performance, and co-editor of The Presidency in American Politics and American State and Local Politics. He has published research in the American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, Political Science Research Quarterly, Polity, Social Science Quarterly, American Politics Quarterly, Legislative Studies Quarterly, and other journals. His current research centers on strategic behavior in state Supreme Courts and is funded by the National Science Foundation. Next we have Mr. Mithun Masangani, who is the current Solicitor General of Oklahoma. Mr. Masangani received his JD from Harvard Law School, graduating cum laude, and serving as an editor of the Harvard Law Review. Prior to this, Mr. Masangani graduated summa cum laude from our very own Rice University, Martell College, for those curious. After law school, he went on to clerk for Judge Jerry Edwin Smith on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Prior to entering the Attorney General's office and becoming the Deputy Solicitor General, Mr. Masangani served as an associate at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, specializing in appellate and administrative law. Next we have Dr. Catherine Neal Harris of the Baker Institute. She is the Alfred C. Glassell Third Fellow in Drug Policy at the Baker Institute. She has published in several peer-reviewed journals in various policy areas, including crime, energy, and environmental policy. Her current research focuses on state sentencing policies for drug offenders and the legalization of medical and recreational marijuana. Dr. Harris received a Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice from George Mason University. She earned a master's degree in public administration from Old Dominion University before going on to complete her PhD in public administration and urban policy. She received the Old Dominion University Outstanding PhD Student Award in 2014 and the Simon Scholarship for Academic Performance in 2011 and 2012 by courtesy of the Baker Institute. Next we have Dean Becker. Dean Becker is a contributing expert to the Baker Institute who produces and hosts 9 radio programs for the Drug Truth Network. Becker has consulted with a myriad of experts in the field of drug policy, including Antonio Maria Costa, former head of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Dr. Donald Toskin of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and hundreds of other scientists, prosecutors, and patients. Mr. Becker recently returned from Portugal, where he was interviewing Portuguese drug czar João Golo, the chief scientist at the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction for the Drug Truth Network. Based at KPFT, Houston's Pacifica radio station, the network produces a daily 3-minute report, the 420 Drug War News, and 2 weekly half-hour programs, Cultural Baggage and Century of Lies, broadcasting on more than 90 affiliate stations in the U.S. and Canada. Becker serves as a spokesperson and board member for a plethora of organizations involved in drug policy. His first book, To End the War on Drugs, was released in 2014 and is available on Amazon and Kindle. Thank you. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists.
Good evening. Tonight's topic's particularly fascinating to me for a number of reasons. I grew up in Oregon. I own property in Colorado. I've gotten to watch as the first state, Colorado, to roll this out, and the experiences there. And I hear about it from Oregon. So I've had some personal experience observing this, but I'm also a student of state politics and law. And this isn't just a question about drug policy, it's a question about federalism. It's a question about federal authority, it's a question about state authority. In some ways it resembles prohibition. In that case, there was a huge enthusiasm to ban alcohol, an amendment into the Constitution and an enabling legislation in the Volstead Act that was built up with enthusiasm but with very few resources. And the states were left to enforce prohibition, and we saw how that went. They didn't have the resources or the will to enforce it. This is a little bit different in that I think the states and the federal government were on the same page early on, and marijuana was evil. And we've had sort of a slow walk to a different point where the states are facing severe revenue shortfalls, and enforcing marijuana law is costly. And they look at Colorado, who's legalized it, and they see it's raising significant revenue. Policy spread like a contagion model in the American states. What works jumps to other states. Since Colorado passed it, Oregon, Washington, D.C., Massachusetts, I think, is passing it. And most notably, and perhaps the biggest clash we could imagine, the same night we elected Donald Trump president, California legalized marijuana, meaning as of right now, a majority of Americans live in states where marijuana is legal. And we have an attorney general who's committed to enforcing federal law. Watch the fun ensue. So this is a great topic. I thank the Federalist Society for doing this. They are excellent in bringing great speakers with opposing viewpoints or alternative viewpoints. I don't want to make this into a competition or a fight, but with alternative viewpoints to discuss these and enrich us all. I have no choice as to who goes first, but the format tonight is going to be 12 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A. And so I'd ask you, does any of you choose to go first? And if not, I'll pick something. You want to start at that end and work your way this way? All right. Please begin.
Okay. So I'm going to talk very briefly just about some of the impacts that marijuana reform has had so far, and also about some of the alternative models for regulating marijuana other than the commercial market that we're seeing so far in most of the states. So economically, there have been some significant benefits of legalization. I actually moderated another marijuana event that was on campus last night, and several of the panelists there were a part of and were familiar with the marijuana industry in states where it's legal. They all reported seeing an increase in jobs related to the industry, as well as a rise in all these ancillary services for the industry. Security services, legal services, marijuana-focused real estate agents, marketing specialists, software, development, packaging, extraction equipment for oils and edibles, I mean, you name it. So there's a lot of other businesses associated with the marijuana industry other than just growing and selling marijuana. Also, states are bringing in a lot of tax revenue. So since it legalized in 2014, Colorado has collected over $500 million in taxes and fees. Nevada made $30 million in tax revenue in the first 6 months that it opened its adult use market. And a lot of this money, states are saying that they're putting it towards, public health-related issues. And in Oregon in 2017, the state put $85 million of its revenue collected through taxes towards schools, public health, police, and local government. So that's just an example of how some of that money is being reinvested by states. When you look at the industry itself, it has faced some challenges. One of the biggest is banking, and this gets kind of directly at some of the issues of state and federal conflict. So most large banks in the U.S. will not accept marijuana businesses as clients. This means that a majority of the business is a cash-only business, which creates a security risk for people, because then they end up having stores with thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, and also having to physically transport hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. And this is one of the reasons that marijuana-related security services have become such a profitable industry as well. There are some regional banks in certain areas that are starting to do business with marijuana companies. But again, right now it's just still very difficult for individuals in the industry to use banking services because large banks don't want clients who are operating illegally under federal law. Banks are very risk averse, and it's seen as a large risk. And recently, Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced that he was rescinding the Obama-era Cole memo. The Cole memo was essentially a directive telling federal prosecutors to refrain from enforcing federal marijuana laws against individuals or organizations if they were operating legally under their state's laws. So by rescinding that memo, Sessions essentially gave prosecutors the okay to use their discretion to enforce federal prohibition laws, even against people operating legally under their state laws. So far, to my knowledge, there hasn't been any case where federal prosecutors have done this, but one of the effects of Sessions' decision was to make banks even less willing to venture into the marijuana industry. Banks and also potentially large investors. So in addition to not having access to traditional banking services, it's also very difficult for marijuana entrepreneurs to get access to capital. So this means that it requires a lot of upfront money to get involved in business. And this is one of the reasons that so far the industry has been largely dominated by white men, as this group just tends to have easier access to capital upfront than do women and people of color. So those are some of the things that are going on with the industry itself. It's certainly facing some growing pains, but then this also has additional conflicts because of the discrepancies between federal and state law. On balance, so again, when you look at the economics of it, it seems that marijuana legalization has been largely positive for states that have embraced it. And in some ways, those effects were never really disputed. Most people agree that yes, there would be tax revenue to be seen from legalizing marijuana. Instead, a lot of the concern around marijuana legalization is in the impact that it's going to have on public health, and specifically on youth rates. So if you look at trends among teens, which tends to be the group people are most concerned about, national trends indicate that more teens increasingly are perceiving marijuana use as less risky than they did in the past. But perceptions of risk do not translate into higher rates of use. In Colorado, teen use now is lower than it was prior to adult use legalization. So among 12 to 17-year-olds, and this is data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which has been conducting an annual survey on drug use since the 1970s. They show that past month marijuana use has decreased from over 12% just prior to legalization in 2014 to 9% in 2015 and 2016. Rates of teen alcohol, tobacco, and heroin use are also down in Colorado. Now, marijuana use among 18 to 25-year-olds, 26 and older, has increased in Colorado since legalization, but alcohol use among these groups has declined, suggesting that some people might be actually substituting marijuana for alcohol. So at this point, it doesn't seem likely that legalization is leading to significantly higher rates of use, but it's also too early to tell what the overall public health impacts of legalization will be. But then another important indicator is not just whether legalization contributes to more people using, but whether it contributes to people using more often. So alcohol and tobacco companies make the majority of their profits from the heaviest users, not the occasional users. And while the majority of marijuana users use infrequently, the small proportion of daily users account for over 50% of marijuana consumed. And again, it's still too early to draw conclusions about long-term impacts, but it does seem fair to say that under a commercial model like we see in states so far, marijuana businesses have a financial interest in more people using the product and in more people using their product more often. So there's certainly a public health concern there, but I think it's important to realize that a commercial market is not the only way to legalize. I think we often get in this discussion, we either have prohibition or maybe decriminalization, or you have full-on legalization. But states could also do other things. They could opt to keep production on a small scale by legalizing cannabis clubs. These are clubs that allow members to grow plants collectively. They can share and trade with each other, but not with non-members. And that's one way to keep production on a smaller scale, that there is still potential for a black market there. There's also been talk in some states of limiting legalization to just allow people to grow their own plants for personal use only. But in reality, this also still leaves the door open for a black market because not everyone's going to want to take the trouble to grow their own plants, and some people that do grow their own are going to have the excess amount that then they still want to sell for a profit. And one of the panelists at the event last night spoke of how in DC, where they have legalized but they don't have commercial stores, people will sell t-shirts for $50, but then along with the t-shirt you get a bag of weed. So there's ways that people can get around those kinds of things and still allow the black market to proliferate. But there are ways that states can allow for sales that do reduce the black market and create revenue for the public coffers without having full-fledged commercialization. The market can be limited to nonprofits or to for-benefit companies. Those are companies which maximizing shareholder profits is not their only goal, so they have more than just one goal. So they could be interested in public health, positive public health outcomes as well. States could also choose to control marijuana production and sales themselves, sort of like the way some states have a monopoly on liquor stores. I'm from Virginia, we have ABC stores there, so you can only buy liquor from state-owned stores. And that kind of state monopoly model isn't feasible right now because of federal prohibition. If federal prohibition were to change, this could be then a possibility for states to consider, but also still generate tax revenue, and it could also be better for public health. At this point, though, it seems likely that most states will choose to go the way of the commercial market, maybe with some exceptions. And a big reason for this is that so far all states that have legalized, with the exception of Vermont, have done so through the ballot initiative process. So that's where voters are essentially allowed to vote for legalization versus the process going to the state legislature. And with this process, when voters vote to legalize on the ballot initiative, state legislatures are essentially required to enact the laws written in the proposition that passed. And most of these propositions call for a commercial market model. Now, you may not be surprised to also learn that a lot of the financial backing for these propositions comes from people that already have large financial stakes in the marijuana industry. So if we do start, though, to see more legislatures acting to legalize like we did in Vermont, or if there's a major change to federal law, it may be possible to see some alternative systems set up. In either case, though, I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that these alternatives do exist. And also to consider that, if we are going to stick with the commercial market, then there's important ways to regulate that also serve public health interests, such as taxing marijuana products on the amount of THC that they have versus just setting a flat sales tax of, say, 20%. So that's one thing that you can do. Also ensuring accurate product information and labeling, which still there's a lot of that lacking in a lot of instances. And I'll just finish by saying that, for me, the two most important reasons to end marijuana prohibition are, one, to give people medical access to a plant that can help them with their pain or other chronic conditions, but also to ensure that no one's getting arrested or fined or a criminal record or any of the other collateral consequences that come with prohibition. So I'll support a commercial marijuana market if it's the only alternative to prohibition, but I would prefer to see a market that balances the public health concerns as well. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Exceptionally well timed, with 1 minute and 18 seconds left over.
Oh.
I think you need more than 12 minutes.
You
can have that extra minute and 18 seconds.
So thank you for the Rice Federalist Society for having me. It's my first time back at Rice as a speaker. Normally I'm just a creepy alumnus walking around campus. But it's also my 10th year reunion, so maybe I'll return to creepy alumnus status soon. I want to spend some time thinking today about the legal issues surrounding what's been going on with marijuana policy reform. It's been sort of brought up several times that there's this tension between what the states are doing and the reality of federal law, and I want to kind of explore what that means for our legal system. I'm not going to really talk about whether, marijuana legalization is a good idea or how we should do it. We've got policy experts on the other side of me. I'm a lawyer. I'm a humble lawyer. I don't really know too much about that, and on top of that, it's on the Oklahoma ballot in June. But I am a constitutional law lawyer, and so I think talking about the constitutional law implications of what's been going on is important. And I want to suggest that the course of the way things have been taking place over the last 5 years is not one of the ways that it should take place under our constitutional system. I want to suggest that we shouldn't allow our enthusiasm for policy reform to lead us to tearing down the constitutional order that we've set up over the last 250 years. And I want to suggest that this is probably a good learning moment to think about what that system is, to think about the rule of law, and to think about the nature of our democratic regime. So let's start with the baseline truth that's been mentioned several times now. Marijuana is illegal under federal law. Its use, its possession, its manufacture, it's illegal everywhere in the nation by everyone, with some small exceptions for clinical testing and things like that. It's been illegal since 1970, and it's a federal law just like the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So, if you wanted to engage in marijuana policy reform, how would you go about doing that? Well, there's at least 3 ways I can think of. So option 1 is for the government, the executive branch, to administratively reschedule marijuana. Under the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, I'll say CSA a couple times, that means Controlled Substances Act, drugs are put into different schedules. Schedule 1 is where marijuana is. That's for drugs with a high potential for abuse and no generally accepted medical use, and those drugs in Schedule 1 can't be possessed for practically any purpose. There's some other schedules, like Schedule 2 or Schedule 3, which allow certain uses for those drugs under controlled circumstances, like by prescription or in hospitals and things like that. And so one option is to reschedule marijuana from Schedule 1 to some other schedule. And that can be done by the Attorney General acting through the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, and it's been tried. They've asked for the Attorney General to do so since 1972, since 2 years after the Controlled Substances Act was passed to begin with. And it just hasn't happened over and over again. Administration after administration, from Nixon to Reagan to Clinton to most recently the Obama administration 2 times, rejected the idea of rescheduling marijuana. So that's option 1. The executive branch can administratively reschedule it. Option 2 is Congress can pass a thing called a law. They can reschedule marijuana in the Controlled Substances Act by passing a law. They can take marijuana completely out of the Controlled Substances Act. They can repeal the Controlled Substances Act altogether. This is probably the most straightforward way of doing things. It's the way we should all want things to be done. Our representatives go to Congress and a majority vote on changing the national policy as we want them to change it. That's how law is made. That's sort of Schoolhouse Rock level basicness. I hope kids are still watching Schoolhouse Rock, otherwise I'm mistaken myself. And this hasn't happened, despite numerous bills attempting to do so for many, many years. But I fear that in this country we've forgotten that that's how law should work. We heard in the last administration, President Obama say 1,000 times he's got a pen and a phone, and we forget that's not how national policy should be set by the whims of just one man, even if that man happens to be sitting in the Oval Office. We have a system of representative democracy, and we shouldn't be just giving more and more power to the president and to the bureaucrats merely because we don't like the results of that system, because it's difficult to change things through that system. And this goes for other things other than just marijuana policy. But I think the biggest indication that we, as a society, are starting to forget that that's how things should operate is the reaction to General Sessions' actions she referred to. Because the senator from Colorado, Cory Gardner, said, well, you know, Jeff Sessions, I really don't like what you did, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold up all the nominees to the Department of Justice that I can, U.S. Marshals, U.S. Attorneys, national security posts, until, you know, you change your policy. And this is particularly ironic because Cory Gardner is a senator. He has more power than anybody else in this nation to introduce a bill to change the Controlled Substances Act and get his colleagues to vote for it. And yet, instead of pursuing that route, i.e. doing his job, he gets mad at the Attorney General for doing his job, which is, as an executive branch official, to execute and enforce the law. And so I think when we've gotten to a place where our lawmakers themselves have sort of forgotten, conveniently or not, that it is their job to set national policy by passing laws, we're at a dangerous point in understanding our democracy. So that's option 2. You can pass a law to amend the Controlled Substances Act. But federal law is not the end-all, be-all of things. Federal statutes aren't, because federal laws themselves can be unlawful. That is, they can be unconstitutional. And so think about how that works. We have to sort of take a journey back to 1940 and ask you to use your imagination to go back to 1940 on a small farm outside of Dayton, Ohio. want to close your eyes. Please don't try to use your imagination with the help of THC right now. But there's a small farm on Dayton, Ohio. There's a guy named Roscoe. He's the farmer on this farm, Roscoe Filbert. And Roscoe, you know, he has cows and chickens, and so him and his family, they make eggs and milk, and they sell it to you know, local customers who come by. Maybe about 75 customers a week come by his farm and buy their fresh eggs and fresh milk. And he also raises wheat. And he uses that wheat mainly to feed his farm animals, sometimes to feed his family, sometimes to sell on the market. And one day, these officials from the Secretary of Agriculture in DC come onto his farm and they say, Roscoe, you've been growing too much wheat. You have to pay a heavy fine. And he says, what? He said, well, there's a federal law that says that limits, gives you a quota of how much wheat you can grow, and you've grown too much wheat. And he says, Roscoe's no average farmer. He says, like, well, okay, hold on a second. The Constitution says Congress is an entity of enumerated powers. This means that Congress only has the powers that the Constitution gives it. So, you know, normally we think about our rights as like freedom from the government doing something from us, from the government interfering with our freedom of speech or freedom of religion, but actually far more important than that is that the fact that the Constitution limits what the government can do more than what the government can't do. And so the Constitution lays out a list of things the government can do, and Roscoe says, look, nowhere on that list is something that says, you can tell me how much I can grow wheat on my own farm to put into my own mouth. The Secretary of Agriculture, Claude Wickard, says, yeah, actually I can, because Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce. And Roscoe's like, interstate commerce? I'm growing wheat on my own farm, putting it into my own mouth. How is that interstate commerce? There's nothing going to other states. And they can't really resolve this dispute, so they go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Wickard v. Fulmer. And if you're rooting for Roscoe, I've got bad news for you. Roscoe loses at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, look, well, you know, you're a farmer growing wheat on your own farm to use on your own farm, but if you weren't using it on your own farm, you'd be selling it on the market. And if 1,000 other farmers do the same thing, well, that might actually affect the interstate market for wheat. And so if you aggregate that over 1,000 different farmers, you've actually affected interstate commerce, therefore Congress can regulate you in their power to regulate interstate commerce. Now you might be thinking, well, by that logic, Congress could do practically anything. They have been transformed from an entity of limited, enumerated powers to one with near universal and unlimited power. Now why am I talking about this? Well, you fast forward 60 to 70 years and you get to 1996 when California authorizes medical marijuana in California. And this guy named Angel Rage, he grows his own marijuana plants and smokes them for medicinal purposes, all on his own. And the DEA comes in and raids his home and destroys his marijuana plants. And he sues them, saying, hey, what right do you have to regulate the fact that I'm just growing marijuana in my own home and smoking it? And the Supreme Court says, well, remember Farmer Filbert? You're doing the exact same thing. You are impacting the interstate market for marijuana, because if enough people do what you're doing, that's going to cause interstate trafficking, and that is banned under the Controlled Substances Act, and Congress can legitimately do that. And so in order to prevent an interstate market for marijuana, Congress can nip it in the bud, no pun intended, and prevent all local growth. So that leads us to option 3. One way you can lead to state-by-state marijuana reform is to say that Gonzales v. Raich, Wickard v. Filbert, they're wrongly decided. The Supreme Court overturned those things and let states do intrastate markets of marijuana. If you want to regulate interstate trafficking, go ahead. But let's just say that Gonzales v. Raich and Wickard v. Filbert were wrongly decided, and you can't control what goes on in the local market. So we have these 3 different ways that you can go about doing policy reform in the marijuana sphere that comports with the law and the Constitution. But the troubling reality is over the last 5 or 10 years, despite these many ways, the right way to reform, what's been happening is one of the wrong ways to reform. What's happened is that individual states have decided to enact the opposite policy of federal law, and the federal executive branch thus far has cooperated and said, yeah, we're just not going to enforce federal law in those jurisdictions, despite their duty to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. So we're at a Federalist Society meeting, and so I think it's appropriate to talk about something that's already been mentioned, which is federalism. What do we mean when we say federalism? What we don't mean is a caricature of federalism, which is a blind devotion to states' rights. What we mean is the Constitution draws a balance between state and federal power. And most of the time, indeed, it's the federal government that's violating that balance, but that doesn't mean the states can't also violate that balance. But assuming both are acting generally within their appropriate spheres, but they enact conflicting policies, what happens to that conflict? What law controls? And the answer to that is in Article 6, Section 2, which is what's called the Supremacy Clause. It says federal law is the supreme law of the land, and any state law notwithstanding can't be enforced because federal law is supreme. Now, the Supremacy Clause is a key component of our Constitution. And one way to think about it is it's solving a collective action problem. Start with the idea that states can enact policies that are appropriate for their communities, that deal with social and economic problems of their communities. But certain problems are interstate in nature. Think about, throwing pollution into the air or whatever. And so when you have these interstate problems, you have a collective action problem. Because unless you get buy-in from all the states, what happens is that there's no way to solve this problem without states free riding and without the problem actually being solved. So what do you do with the collective action problem? The solution was to get state representatives in Congress to go vote and pass a law and agree to a national policy, agreeing to give up a measure of state sovereignty in order to have a uniform national solution. So now what happens when a state breaks its bargain, right? It goes to Congress and says, yeah, we agree to this law, and later on says, yeah, we're going to sort of step away from that. Alexander Hamilton, who's gotten more popular in recent years, in the Federalist Papers, 2015, said that the lack of the ability to solve this collective action problem of getting states to agree to abide by a single national policy was the great and radical vice of the Articles of Confederation, which was that governing document that governed our country for its first few years of existence that didn't work out until the Constitution came along. He said, under that system, there were national laws that, though in theory were laws, were in practice mere recommendations which the states observe or disregard as their option. The country is then transformed from a true union of states, bound together by a constitution, to, as Hamilton put it, a mere treaty dependent on the good faith of the parties and not the government. So the framers created a solution to that problem, which was the Supremacy Clause. It says federal law, when there's a conflict, reigns supreme. And James Madison, which we're at a Federalist Society event, the logo for the Federalist Society is actually the silhouette of James Madison. He said, without that Supremacy Clause, the Constitution would have been evidently and radically defective. So with all this in mind, let's think about the legal and structural implications of the Federal Controlled Substances Act and state efforts to authorize marijuana under state law. I don't like the term legalize marijuana because it's not true, right? Like, it's not that marijuana is legal in Colorado, it's still illegal under federal law, but there's state authorization for it, put it that way. And so what happened with the Controlled Substances Act? Through Congress, all the states' representatives got together and they voted, and the vast majority of them voted to adopt this national policy that marijuana would be illegal, including, by the way, every single representative from the state of Colorado. And now, certain states, like Colorado, have chosen to renege on that bargain by taking affirmative steps to create a marijuana market for the express purpose of profiting off of it. So for the economics majors in the room, they've reintroduced the collective action problem and are free-riding off the benefits of their invention. Now, all the while, the marijuana is being trafficked to other states, causing precisely the type of interstate problems that Congress was trying to prevent. And I can't actually think of any other situation that's analogous to this at all in American law, unless you go back to sort of the nullification days before the Civil War, where federal law completely prohibits something and state law affirmatively authorizes it. And to think about like what type of things that may result from that, like sort of think about how that might be extended to other situations where a state grants a license to do something that's prohibited under federal law. Imagine the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the state of Texas says, well, it's really costly for our businesses to build all these wheelchair ramps and handicapped bathrooms and things like that, so we're just going to grant licenses to businesses to say, don't have to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the president says, yeah, Texas, you got a good point, we're just not going to enforce the Americans with Disabilities Act in Texas. I mean, people would be up in arms about that, right? That wouldn't fly. And, you know, think about sort of other situations where the states are granting a property interest, a property right in what's contraband under federal law. They're authorizing a market that federal law makes illegal. So move it away from marijuana and take it to machine guns, which are illegal under federal law. If the state started granting licenses for people to use, manufacture, possess machine guns, and the administration just didn't want to enforce the law, people would be up in arms. There would be marches and rallies and hashtags and tweets. But we don't have that in this situation because, well, some people are upset about it, but generally people are okay with the result, but not sort of thinking too much about the process. And some of the same people who are so concerned about our fabric of our democracy right now turn a blind eye to how marijuana reform has been taking place, and just because they like the results, even if those results undermine our most fundamental institutions. In short, my basic message today is our democracy provides several mechanisms for marijuana policy reform. We should be concerned about the fact that reform has not gone by any of those methods, and instead chosen a path that tends to undermine our constitutional order. So to put it simply, light your joint if you want to, just don't burn the Constitution to do it.
Thank you.
Give one of these Mexican beat workers a couple of tokes off a marijuana cigarette. Next thing you know, thinks he's been elected president of Mexico. Sets out to kill his enemies. That's the kind of BS that got these laws passed in the first place. It was true bigotry, racial, I don't know, just domination. The majority of those arrested for drugs are still black and brown. They're still poor people. To make alcohol illegal, they needed a constitutional amendment. They got the states to sign on to do it. When they repealed it, they had to undo that, get more states to sign on to do away with that prohibition. For marijuana, they just threw out a bunch of morals. They used this guy named Harry J. Anslinger. I don't know if you've heard of Harry, but he was head of the alcohol prohibition outfit. And when that ended, he needed a job. So he set up the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Got himself a good long-term job. That lasted until about 1969-70, when they changed over to the Drug Enforcement Administration. But the point I'd like to get to is, Harry was a moralist. He pretended to be knowledgeable. He spread his BS around the country and eventually around the world, demanding that prohibition forward, that it overshadow prior perceptions that people who use drugs were unconditionally exterminable. They were useless. They were to be demonized, cast aside, imprisoned. The whole point being, there is no real justification for the laws against marijuana or any of these other drugs. This is a means whereby the population can be controlled and frightened into submission, into believing these things to be necessary. I'm going to read you a couple of quotes from Mr. Harry J. Anslinger. You may, I hope some of you have seen the movie Reefer Madness. It's an old 1936 movie, I believe it is, and shows people just smoking marijuana and going completely nuts. And it was used to frighten parents into believing these laws to be necessary. Here's a couple from Harry J. Anslinger. Marijuana is the most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind. That was carried in newspapers around the country by, what's his name, William Randolph Hearst, had many of newspapers around the country. Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. All right? That's the kind of BS that brought all this about. You smoke a joint and you're likely to kill your brother. Okay? This is the kind of stuff that was used to justify these laws. Now, you know, I have spent the last 20 years of my life, I started working for the New York Times, their drug policy forum editor. I got to interview good folks like Governor Gary Johnson out of Arizona. New Mexico, thank you. And the point I'd like to get to here is that there still is no justification. There's not one person on the planet willing to sit down and go toe-to-toe with me over the need for this drug war. We've arrested 40 million of our fellow citizens. We've spent $1 trillion, maybe $3 trillion. We've never done any good to stop the use of drugs, not for adults and not for children. The best place to buy drugs in America is probably in colleges like this, followed closely by high schools, then by junior highs, and then by our prisons. There is no reason to continue this. It is a complete fabrication with no justification whatsoever. Drugs are stronger, deadlier than ever before. They have fentanyl, 10,000 times stronger than morphine, and yet we feel that we can stop these cartels. The more we try to stop them, the more violence is created, the more barbarism goes on in Guatemala, Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador. Right now, Afghanistan, the #1 place to get your opium is 6 cents a gram in Afghanistan. They make the heroin over there. They ship it mostly to Europe, but we get some on our west coast. Marijuana is an addictive drug which produces in its users insanity, criminality, and death. That was the catchphrase. That's what they used in Congress for years. That's what they still use to this day, without knowing the basic facts that, you know, marijuana in its pure form has never killed anybody ever in the history of mankind, and yet it is still prohibited. It is based on this fear factor, this 100-year-old propaganda that still stands to this day. Reefer madness, from my perspective, rules the whole of the drug war. It is this fear of drugs. It is this quasi-religion that people believe in because their daddy did, and they're just not going to back down. They made their bones through this policy, and they cannot now back down from what they pronounced and what they committed to, the millions of arrests, the needless deaths and decades behind prison bars. Classic example of the insanity of this drug war. What this marijuana does. Right here in this city, here's 1970. There's a small protest going on down on Montrose Boulevard. A couple of gentlemen are passing a joint. A black man steps in. Can I have a hit? He takes a hit. He passes it to the next man, and they put the cuffs on him. They arrested him for distribution of drugs. He got sentenced to 10 years in prison. His name was Lee Otis Johnson. He got out after about 2.5. But that's the insanity of this drug war, entrapping people, setting them up by the millions to justify their lies in this regard. A complete opposite. Marijuana leads to pacifism and communist brainwashing. You know, any and every way they can influence people's perceptions of this drug, they were willing to do it. They continue to do it to this day. Colorado's earning, as Katie said, $500 million in tax revenue. It is making money. It is creating jobs. Nobody's dying. There is no reason to consider this a bad investment of our efforts. It is dangerous to the mind and body, and particularly dangerous to the criminal type, because it releases all its inhibitions. The use of cannabis, whether smoked or ingested in its various form, undoubtedly gives rise to a form of addiction which has serious social consequences. Abandonment of work, propensity to theft and crime, disappearance of reproductive power. You know, it'll rob you of your manliness. That goes on to this day. They say it hurts men's testosterone. Any and every way to frighten people into not using this. Now, it was mentioned I just returned from Switzerland and Portugal. I got to interview Portugal's drug czar. They haven't legalized marijuana there. They have decriminalized it, just like they decriminalized heroin and cocaine and everything else. But they're not certain whether they should legalize it. And I had a good talk with them. I think they're going to reconsider here soon, but they're waiting to see the long-term effect out of Colorado, California, the other 8 or 9 states where it's now nearly legal. Again, quoting Harry J. Anslinger, I don't think there's such a thing as not being able to cure an addict. Marijuana addicts must go to a federal narcotics farm. And they did have a federal narcotics farm. I think it was in Tennessee. Right near where they now grow marijuana. It's at the University of Mississippi. I'm sorry, University of Mississippi. They now grow marijuana by the ton each year. And there's 3 people left in America who get marijuana free from the federal government, approved by the DEA, approved by the FDA, shipped to them in a tin can every month. One of them gets 300 joints every 28 days. His name is Irv Rosenfeld. He's a stockbroker in Florida who goes out on his lunch break and smokes a couple of joints with his boss's approval because it helps him he has a degenerative bone diseases, and it just helps him to get through his day in a more appropriate fashion. Another young lady in Florida, I might think of her name, but she gets 300 joints every 30 days. And she's one of the 2 or 3 people left who get this marijuana from the U.S. government, prescribed by prescription by the U.S. government. Here in Texas, we have had a quasi-medical marijuana law put forward that really benefits maybe a handful of kids, maybe 5, 10, 12 kids who have a particular type of epilepsy who must get 2 doctors' recommendations and be shown to not benefit from all the other drugs that are on the pharmacist's shelf. And they pay outrageous amounts for CBD oil. And I can't tell you whether this hemp CBD oil is any good or how it compares to cannabis CBD. But I just think they're getting an outrageous price, $100 a week for a little kid for potential medicine. I don't need the 12 minutes, I guess. What I want to say is there is no reason for the marijuana law to exist. It doesn't do any good for anybody. It is a fabrication. You know, I wonder why we needed a constitutional amendment to make alcohol illegal, but we didn't for marijuana. And I think it's because somehow those who disapprove of marijuana think they're more moral, more capable of rational decision, and just hold it over the marijuana users because we've allowed them. People hide from admitting they use this stuff. They can't do it at work, at school. You know, they fear repercussions within society, and so they keep their mouths shut. 20% of Americans smoke marijuana. What the hell are we afraid of?
Thank you. When I began, I corrected myself and I said we had opposing viewpoints, and I corrected that to say alternative viewpoints. And I think this is evidence of why. Because we had alternative viewpoints, but I think if we had opposing viewpoints, we'd have to decide one was right and one was wrong. And my impression is everybody's right. There's good policy reasons to think marijuana should probably be legalized. The negative consequences of marijuana are not abundant. And in fact, there is evidence to suggest that opioid use goes down when marijuana is legalized, and there are other beneficial factors. And so there's, I'm not going to say it's necessarily a good drug, but it's not as bad as what it made out to be, which leads me to my other point. We can also agree that the conditions under which the marijuana was criminalized was crazy. I've seen reefer madness, and it was propaganda in the worst imaginable form, and it was racist. So was prohibition, for that matter. And thirdly, we do have a constitutional crisis. So all 3 of these people are right. The question I want to ask is, how do we have this constitutional crisis? Why are they doing it? Now, I'll offer you something. The time the CSA was passed, it's sort of the high point of federal largesse, 1970. And the way the federal power has always worked, carrot and stick, grants and aids. The federal government had a lot of money. The federal government doesn't have a lot of money now. Those grants and aids have gone away. The DEA, in 2012, arrested 30,000 people for drug busts. In that same year, states and localities arrested 1,328,000 people for drug busts. I think that works out to about 3% for the federal government. It's a federal law, but they're not enforcing it. And they don't have the money anymore to help the states enforce it. So it's almost like an unfunded mandate dumped on the state. And then you put in a fiscal crisis that's facing virtually every state. What are they going to do? So I'd open it up to that. We have a constitutional crisis. What are we going to do about it? I think it's not immorality that's driving this. It's dollars and cents. So I'll open up for that for a comment. I'll quickly get to questions in the audience.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that you know, you're right that alcohol prohibition was done by constitutional amendment. Alcohol prohibition was, of course, done before the 1940 decision of Wickard v. Filbert. So when the New Deal court opened up the idea that federal power was expansive, it paved the way for the 1970 Controlled Substances Act. It needed a constitutional amendment anymore. They probably would have done it if they had it in 1970. Definitely not now. And actually, that actually might sort of work for benefit. It's really hard to repeal a constitutional amendment. It's easier to repeal a CSA. But I think something you actually wrote at reading on that plane right here was that the Sessions memo would, you know, if federal marijuana laws start to be enforced, and you know, for the federal government to do it, it's actually not that hard. They don't have to go after every sort of Joe Blunt on the street. They go shut down one grow facility. They go shut down one retail shop. Who else is going to keep their businesses open, right? But what it does is it sets up the tension that can be resolved in legitimate means. If 60–70% of the populace want marijuana, you know, descheduled or rescheduled, that can happen through a congressional law only if the tension is built to a certain point where there's a sort of an activism to get people to actually care about repealing the federal law. And I think that there are, I think that the combination of people in the executive branch who care about the rule of law to begin with and pursue their constitutional mandates to actually enforce federal law, and people within the states who want federal law to be changed may be the sort of impetus for doing so. And each state can have its own policy after that happens. But I think that the sort of currently unsustainable route, where you have problems with banking, you also have problems with a whole bunch of things. Public housing, right? You can't get federal benefits for public housing if you are using illicit drugs. Your right to bear arms. You can't purchase a firearm if you check on the form that I've used illicit drugs before. And so that irreconcilable tension, I think, can be resolved if we abide by sort of our constitutional system, and the federal executive branch, regardless of the administration, takes their duty to take care of the federal laws and force seriously, meets with the desire for grassroots reform on the ground. And what happens after that. But I think the current status quo sort of impedes that resolution.
Well, could I throw in the thought here? You know, you're talking about the 1970 Institutional Controlled Substances Act. That's the most ludicrous naming I could ever think of. It has never been in control of these substances. But Timothy Leary got busted at the border. He was going into Mexico and said, "Oh, no, I'm coming back to the U.S." He had a joint in his pocket. They searched him, they busted him, they made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and he was found to be innocent. So they repealed the original 1937 Marijuana Tax Act. They came up with the DEA, the Controlled Substances Act, and then there was a challenge to this new law. It went to Francis L. Young, a federal judge who studied the situation and wrote that this new law was arbitrary and capricious and should be done away with. But the DEA influenced things and held on to it, and it's continued to this day. But the point being that it's still arbitrary and capricious. There's no reason for this. It's morals and not rational or scientific meaning or determination. And I just think, again, it's this belief in some set of morals that has created this church of prohibition that people belong to and don't give a damn what the truth in science may be.
And, well, I'll just add, talking about Sessions and about looking at this at the congressional level, you know, one of the things to me about the response to Sessions memo is that everybody hated it. Like, I don't, you know, Republicans, Democrats, all across the board really came out against it. And so, you know, that really kind of brings up the question, everybody, you know, hates that all he's basically doing is enforce the law as written, then why is this a law in the first place? And so, again, right, I think it'll be interesting to see the extent that prosecutors use if they use their discretion to go after individuals or businesses, and how that coming to a head might put pressure on congressional representatives and senators to want to change the law. That said, there have been laws introduced, or legislation introduced in the Senate to change marijuana laws. They've gotten some support, obviously not enough support to pass. And I think, in Texas, in Texas, I don't know how many of you follow trends in state law, but there have been attempts in the last couple of sessions to decriminalize marijuana possession, to make it a civil penalty, and also to expand medical access to marijuana. We talked to legislatures during session about this kind of legislation, and especially when it came to making marijuana possession a civil penalty, so taking away, the misdemeanor that's associated with it. What representatives would say is, yeah, personally, like, I'm not against decriminalization, but, my primary voters are. And it comes back to that, especially for conservatives, they're worried about getting primaried by somebody more conservative than them. So even if you come at, and this is, I think, does go back to the issue of the crisis of democracy and public opinion, and what the majority wants. So you can show representative polls all day that say the majority of the public supports ending marijuana prohibition, and they'll say, well, not the voters that voted in my primary. And that's what's happening in Texas. I wouldn't be surprised if the same kind of thing is happening at the national level, especially in the House of Representatives, with some, especially conservatives that come from districts where they are concerned about still appearing soft on crime. And I think that goes back, you talked, Dean, about the moral element of this. And, if you look at the polling, younger generations are much more in favor of repealing marijuana prohibition. Support is lower among older generations that did grow up with the reefer madness aspect of it. So on the one hand, the stigma for marijuana is declining, or it hasn't even been there for younger generations, but among older generations it still exists. And so I think that is a challenge, the way that our elections are set up, and with gerrymandering and with the concerns about primaries. I think it does make it especially challenging to have the law changed at the national level.
I want to, again, I'm here to sort of talk more about how we think about the law and what policy should be, but I want to sort of push back on the idea that sort of morality is a bad basis for law. And I think that idea was more popular, maybe about a decade ago than it is now. But I think, my view of things is that morality is always the basis for law. If you say we should protect the environment, because you have a certain morality that says that's a good thing. If you say we should have marijuana, that's based on morality that's on your sort of view of compassionate use and things like that. And so, I always get uncomfortable when people criticize a law is based on morals. Well, all law is based on, you may disagree with those morals, right? And so may voters. And you may think that the empirical or scientific basis behind why they form those moral beliefs may be wrong and attack those. But I'm always uncomfortable when people talk negatively about morality being the basis for law.
Well, again, is it moral to support terrorist cartels, gangs, indiscriminate overdoses, death, madness, disease? That's what prohibition is about. That's what it contributes every day of the year. And it hasn't given back anything near sufficient to counter the horror it inflicts on the whole world. It's a belief system that has no rational basis, and I don't see any.
Why is alcohol more moral than marijuana? I mean, they're both intoxicants, and
Kill
I think
people.
the detrimental consequences of both, we could argue about that. Make a strong case alcohol is worse.
Yes, sir.
Why is alcohol somehow on a higher moral plane? Because the big alcohol lobbied for effective legislation to make alcohol legal, and marijuana has been made illegal. I mean, if the morality doesn't seem to play out in this argument to me. I mean, I don't understand why marijuana is immoral and alcohol is moral.
Yeah, and I'm not arguing one way or the other about that, right?
I don't. They should both be immoral, or neither one should be.
I would just add to that there's actually been some research done looking at arguments against repealing marijuana prohibition, and the basis for arguments have changed. So it did used to be more on the whole idea that marijuana is evil and it makes people evil, people that use it are evil. But now the message that you're seeing more is about it being a gateway drug and about how it affects teen use. So the arguments, I think, for it have changed from more of a moral kind of argument to this concern about use and gateway and public health concerns. So I think that shift is reflected in the rhetoric that you hear in the conversation.
And I think that's also, there's sort of there's a cultural thing too, right? So alcohol has a sort of much deeper root in our culture than marijuana.
Actually, marijuana has been around since the inception. It grew on people's farms. They used it with wild abandon. And stills were too. Washington kept his own still and produced his own alcohol. But marijuana is in the 20th century.
I don't know, I don't know. I guess like I'm thinking alcohol going back sort of to, 1000 BC.
Alcohol made a civilization possible. The
right.
first thing that they did was brew beer because the water's
and so when we think about sort of the deaths caused by alcohol versus the deaths caused by, for example, let's just say guns, right? I mean, deaths caused by alcohol are a lot worse. But the talk of prohibiting, reforming alcohol law is not near as the talk about reforming gun laws. And the reason is because alcohol is a part of our culture in all parts of the United States, whereas guns are only a part of our culture in some part of the United States. And so that cultural disconnect makes it a lot easier for people who are not part of the gun culture to talk about the death caused by guns versus death caused by alcohol. It's actually a lot more.
I want to underscore the point you were making, and that is, when they made marijuana illegal, people were buying cannabis products at the grocery store, at the drugstore. Yeah. They believed in it. It was used for corns. It was used for coughs. It was used for all kinds of maladies. But along came Harry J. Anslinger and his ilk, talking about marijuana, this deadly new drug out of Mexico. It's taking over. It's attracting the children. It's destroying the nation. And people got scared. Oh, marijuana, oh my Lord. And they went along with it to get along. And that's what helped bring about these laws, was lies. Lies about what product they were talking about, and another means of frightening and controlling, dominating the people.
So I'm actually interested in if there's any sort of daylight between your views, because it seems like not only marijuana, but you think sort of no drug should have either prohibition or regulation for that matter?
Right now, heroin ain't even heroin. It's 10,000 times stronger. It's
Right,
fentanyl. It's elephant tranquilizer, and we're fooling ourselves to believe that we will ever control these so-called controlled substances.
So is your view that we shouldn't regulate fentanyl at all?
No, every bag should have an exact list of the ingredients contained therein. And people, just like the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, I want to stop right there. If people know what they're buying, if it's poisonous or deadly, they know what they're buying. Give it to the adults. Anybody sells it to kids, lock them up.
Can you share that?
I think that prohibition in general has created a lot of the problems that we have now. If somebody has pure unadulterated heroin and they know the dose to take, they're not going to overdose from it. There's no side effects really other than constipation from pure unadulterated heroin. And in Swiss, the heroin-assisted treatment program there has been quite successful in treating addicts. And what they do for people that are severely addicted to heroin, they provide pharmaceutical-grade heroin from the government to maintain that addiction. There's been no overdoses from people that are in that program. So my point, though, is that I do think that prohibition ends up in people in more dangerous substances. I think even with marijuana, the proliferation of the synthetic cannabinoids is a direct consequence of prohibition. I don't think that we should legalize, all drugs and make everything, available in the store. You can't go to the store and buy cocaine or crack or whatever. I'm not saying that. But I do argue for a public health approach to this, so ways to minimize the harms associated with drug use. And I think that, there are models, Portugal, Dean mentioned, they've decriminalized use and possession. So there's obviously some legal issues with saying that, well, it's legal, you can possess it, but you can't sell it. But, I think that there should be a way to treat addiction and to minimize harms that are associated with use that doesn't penalize people or incarcerate them for that use.
Okay, last week I was in Bern, Switzerland. I was interviewing Dr. Christoph Berkey, the inventor of the Swiss heroin injection program. And you're right, they haven't had one overdose. The patients come into the clinics twice a day, and what do you think they get their fix? They go back to work. They go back to tend their children. The crime rate has dropped to below 50% of what it was before they began the program.
I believe it's a condition in the program for the addict to stay out of trouble.
Oh, yeah.
You get the government pharmaceutically regulated heroin at a reasonable or no cost.
No cost.
But you gotta stay out of trouble, which is the exact opposite of our situation where you gotta be a criminal to get your drugs, right? And you create a lot of crime, and it's not regulated drugs, and there's ODs and everything else.
Yeah, I just think that, trying to regulate the supply of something, economics teaches you that if there's a demand, right, somebody's going to come and meet the demand. And if you try to take away, if somebody wants to get high, they're going to find a way to get high. And so, people sniff markers. There's been an issue with ammonium AD, which is a medication that if taken in a lot in very high doses.
It's got opioids.
Right, yes. So there's people that are doing that. So people, I just don't think that prohibition, the model that we have, I think is broken and that it doesn't achieve what it was initially intended to achieve.
Everybody's been really patient. Let's open it up to questions. Yeah.
So I understand what you're saying about like constitutional order and keeping everything with the government still like regulation, and I get it. But my question is more like, why haven't we been able to change marijuana from being a Schedule I drug that's like equivalent to heroin, and Schedule II is like cocaine, meth, morphine, and like there's tons of research that show that marijuana is not nearly as harmful as any of those. So like, why has it been so hard to even just like push it down to Schedule II or Schedule III? Is it like where you were talking about the propaganda? Is that all of it?
Yeah, I mean, I again, I'll defer sort of the policy